Hey guys, tonight we wander not toward a philosopher or a king, but towards something far thornier and stranger. What dating and courtship actually looked like in the Middle Ages, along with a few other odd little corners of history. Believe it or not, chasing love in an age of plagues, dowries, and ever-present chaperones managed to be even clumsier than sending someone a sleepy little message in the small hours of the morning. From the polished songs of courtly love to marriages bargained for in livestock, medieval romance had far less to do with fluttering hearts, and far more to do with who owned which patch of land. Before we drift into it, you might take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what happens here. And feel free to leave a note in the comments saying where you're tuning in from and what the hour is for you. It's always a pleasure to see who has gathered from every corner of the globe. Now, let's gently ease into tonight's slow wander together. Picture yourself in a muddy medieval village, or perhaps a cold stone keep, puzzling over how a person finds love. Perhaps you strike up a chat, admire the cut of someone's hose, ask whether they pass through often. No. That is simply not how any of this functions. In the Middle Ages, dating as we picture it doesn't really exist. There's no flirting, no messages, no long meandering walks to see where things drift. Instead, your parents, or your lord, or your abbot, have already settled who you'll marry, when it will happen, and how many cows must change hands to make it final. Among the nobility, you've likely been promised to someone since before your voice deepened. You and your intended might lay eyes on one another for the very first time at the wedding itself, which is every bit as stiff and strange as it sounds. The whole arrangement turns on land, titles, and ties between families, not on whether the two of you actually suit each other. If you happen to be a peasant, the rules loosen a touch, but only a touch. Your family still holds firm opinions, and affection rarely enters the conversation. Perhaps your parents have noticed a pleasant girl whose household keeps a fine dairy goat. Perhaps they admire a young man who can thatch a roof without tumbling off it. And just like that, a courtship is underway. It isn't that people of this era feel nothing romantic, they certainly do. It simply isn't what matters most. The aim is survival, inheritance, and keeping the social order steady. Falling in love before a marriage is arranged is reckless. Falling in love outside of marriage is a scandal. Either way, the world disapproves, unless you happen to be a figure in some mournful poem, in which case feel free to ache as dramatically as you please. And still, you dream. Perhaps, against every expectation, you lose your heart to someone who was never approved by the family's livestock appraiser. But for the moment, you wait. You obey. You do your best not to fall for the miller's young apprentice. Because in this world, love may belong to the poets, but marriage is the labor of parents, priests, and politics. So suppose someone catches your eye. Maybe it's the easy way they steady a basket of onions atop their head. Maybe it's the brisk confidence with which they beat the mud from a rug. Your medieval heart gives a little leap. A young man needs land, or livestock, or tools, or at the very least a roof that doesn't let in too much rain. Tender words are well and good, but nothing announces a worthy husband quite like a pair of healthy oxen and a roof that can outlast a modest storm. If your father has already pledged the finest goat to your brother, the priesthood may be worth a thought. A young woman's family, meanwhile, must furnish a dowry, whether in coin, in cloth, or in a suspiciously generous flock of geese. However sharp your wit, if your kin can't meet the price, you may well spend a great many quiet hours perfecting your embroidery. Now imagine you genuinely care for someone who sets your weathered heart fluttering. Your eyes meet at the village well. There's a spark. It's tender. It's the stuff of poems, and it is utterly beside the point, because unless your two families stand on roughly equal financial ground, you might as well have fallen for a passing cloud. For the nobility, it's worse still. A marriage is bound up with land, borders, and political favours, so you aren't merely a person, you're a treaty that happens to walk around. Even peasants find no escape. Marriage is a practical affair. You don't wed for butterflies. You wed because your pig pen happens to border someone's wheat field. You dream of passion and settle for irrigation rights. And yet you try anyway. Perhaps you offer a modest gift, a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest only slightly cracked mug. Perhaps they smile, perhaps they don't. But the truth holds firm. In medieval courtship, the flirting is economics, and love is merely a bonus you hope your spouse grows into in time. Now suppose you're neither a peasant fretting over pigs, nor a noble entangled in treaties. Suppose you're a knight with gleaming armour, a tall horse, and questionable gifts for poetry. What does love look like for you? Welcome to the peculiar and rather draining realm of courtly love. This isn't dating at all, it's something closer to performance. Courtly love was a noble pastime, equal parts flirtation and graceful suffering, and thoroughly impractical from start to finish. You, the gallant knight, fix upon a noble lady, very often one already married, and vow to worship her from a careful distance. Not in any physical sense, of course, since that would spoil the whole delicate game. Your task is to suffer beautifully. You might compose a handful of anguished verses about her silvery laugh, or how her hair blazes like the sun, which, in the terms of the day, mostly means she possesses hair, and refrain from insulting your family. You wear her colours at the tournaments. You pine and you sigh. Now and then you joust some poor fellow purely for letting his gaze linger on her too long. As for the lady, her part is to behave as though all of this is terribly flattering while keeping up a chill so complete it could unsettle a glacier. She may send back a letter, a small token, perhaps a ribbon, but mostly she remains mysterious and out of reach, which is precisely the point. The feeling runs high while the actual contact stays slight. At best you might earn a nod from across the hall, or the brush of a finger against your gauntlet during a feast. Anything beyond that and it stops being courtly love and becomes a scandal, or worse, and no one wants that, at least not openly. The whole arrangement worked best when everyone quietly agreed it was mostly make-believe. It offered a way to pour out longing, devotion, and creative anguish without ever upsetting the social order, a kind of medieval release valve, if you like. Was it dramatic? Endlessly. Did it lean far more on poetry than on practicality? Always. But for a long evening caught between battles and tedium, courtly love handed you something to write about and someone to write it for. Just don't go expecting a happy ending, or a kiss, or even so much as eye contact. So you've lost your heart to someone. Wonderful. Now comes the difficult part, showing that affection in a society where touching another person's hand without a chaperone present amounts to nearly a declaration of war. Enter the medieval answer: tokens. Picture it as 12th century messaging, slow, muddled, and wide open to badly mistaken readings. Say you're a knight, hopelessly devoted to Lady Marjorie of wherever it is she's from. You can't get a word with her in private, and your poems keep falling into the hands of her confessor. So what's left? You send her a glove, or perhaps an embroidered sleeve. Nothing whispers devotion quite like mailing someone a piece of your wardrobe. And should you be the one receiving it, congratulations. You now hold a damp linen sleeve you never requested, along with the romantic duty of pretending you understand what it signifies. Is he declaring love? Begging a favor? Hinting at a duel? Anyone's guess. Women offered tokens as well. A ribbon, a lock of hair, a small pendant. Sentimental certainly, but also keenly calculated. Hand the wrong man the wrong token, and you might suddenly find yourself promised to someone with a wandering eye and a fondness for drink. Tokens were meant to stay subtle, a glove pinned to the chest, a ribbon knotted around a sword hilt. Everyone understood the meaning, and no one spoke it aloud. The more cryptic, the better, since it was less about plain communication and more about leaving room for denial. Oh, this glove. No, it's nothing from Lady Joan. It simply turned up on my pillow, faintly scented with lavender, entirely by chance. For common folk the tokens were plainer, a small wood carving perhaps, or a handkerchief stitched in the gaps between chores. Still romantic, only with rather more calluses involved. Tokens carried real risk too. Pass one to the wrong person and rumours caught fire. Receive one you didn't want, and you faced the delicate task of returning someone's sock without insulting their whole bloodline. Yet for all the awkwardness, these little objects held genuine weight. They stood as emblems of love in a world that left precious little space for it. So at last you gather the nerve to speak to the one who's caught your fancy. Maybe you hold out a flower. Maybe you recite a little clumsy verse you most certainly did not lift from a passing minstrel. You're braced for a moment of closeness. Sadly, you are not alone. Welcome to the world of medieval courtship surveillance, where love is never blind but always closely watched by your mother, your priest, a meddlesome cousin, and on some days, all three together. Suppose you're a young woman of marrying age. You never simply go for a walk. You go for a walk with Margaret and her formidably strict aunt, who has already begun to disapprove of your posture. Even on a trip to fetch water, someone is observing. Someone is always observing. It's less courtship than careful spycraft. And if you're a man hoping to court someone, you'd best secure the blessing of her family, her parish priest, and the local web of gossips. You arrive at her door with flowers. Her father lurks behind it, sharpening something. Her mother stirs a pot that hasn't seen a boil in hours. And the village priest just so happens to be strolling past on his way to prayers. The reasoning behind all this watchfulness was straightforward: guard virtue, preserve the family's honour, and above all prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially in private. Chaperones existed to oversee even the most innocent exchanges. Group outings were watched, walks were supervised, and sitting near one another on a bench was permitted only with someone's grandmother knitting close by and pretending not to listen in. The church, naturally, had opinions, a great many of them, and it managed courtship rather, the way a doorman manages a crowded hall. Priests preached sermons on proper conduct and penned long treatises on the perils of flirtation. That's right, The medieval clergy produced anti-flirting manuals, copied out by candlelight while monks looked on in silent judgment from across the scriptorium. Even letters weren't safe. Some monasteries opened love notes simply to inspect them for moral content, a kind of holy censorship. So, if you mean to fall in love, you'll need to grow comfortable doing it quietly and in full view of your entire extended family, and quite possibly the Almighty as well. So you're in love, or at least medieval in love, which is mostly longing, bewilderment, and a fair amount of pacing near windows. You've traded glances across a feast. Perhaps they retrieved your dropped handkerchief and didn't toss it straight into the fire. The tension is almost unbearable, yet still you can't speak openly, what with chaperones, priests, and mothers hovering like the emotional equivalent of border guards. So what do? You write a letter. Ah yes, the secret love letter, the most perilous scrap of parchment since the last notice of excommunication. This is your chance to lay bare your heart in the most veiled and lavishly poetic language you can summon, because you cannot simply blurt out that you fancy someone. No, the words must arrive draped in ornament. Something closer to my spirit is a deer struck through by the arrow of your kindness, wandering the woodlands of longing. That is, assuming you can write at all, which in this era was far from certain. You set your declaration down on vellum or coarse parchment, and the truly devoted might scatter petals across it or touch it with perfume. A word of caution there, though. One nobleman once grabbed a love note to wrap up a herring and sent the bundle to entirely the wrong young woman. The two ended up wed, so all turned out well enough. Then arrives the matter of getting it where it needs to go. Handing it over yourself was out of the question. You required a courier of some kind, a faithful servant, a monk who'd been paid off, or a younger sibling too innocent to grasp the trouble involved. On occasion, a wandering musician would serve, performing your verse in the market square while pretending he had no idea who composed it, terribly discreet, and the poetry itself was hazardous. Genuinely hazardous. The boundary between sweet sentiment and outright heresy was slimmer than the meals people endured during Lent. Should a single one of your images so much as gesture toward the physical, you could end up confessing to desire and to overblown writing alike. Yet for all the restrictions, people kept putting pen to page. A handful of those letters lasted. Certain poems were transcribed and circulated like something forbidden. Within a world of strict roles and endless watching, a folded little scrap of language could feel almost defiant. So you write it, you take the gamble, you set your shaking hand to the page and confess all the things that could never be spoken. Just take care not to leave too plain a signature. The goal is courtship, after all, not a hearing before the church. And then, at last, a pause in the routine, a feast day, a gathering for the harvest, a dance around the pole. Put simply, one of those uncommon strictures when existence isn't only toil, devotion, and pretending you have no particular interest in the blacksmith's daughter. Today, flirtation is permitted. More or less, so long as nobody notices, or everybody notices, but agrees to look the other way. This was the medieval festival, where courtship unfolded beneath the gaze of every single person you'd ever encountered, plus a few hens. Such gatherings were among the rare occasions society blessed, when men and women could mix together, share a laugh, and even, perhaps, hold a glance a moment too long. There is music, there is ale, there is someone sporting a flower crown with alarming self-assurance. Rarely had so many faces dropped the usual mask of gloom. A peasant hoping to catch a sweetheart's eye might enter the sack race, chase down a greased pig, or attempt to keep 3 stale loaves in the air at once. Tumbling off a hay bale while keeping your composure was as good as announcing your availability. The dance was your finest opportunity for any real closeness. The steps were strict, but a turn timed just right, or a brush of hands that wasn't quite an accident, could speak louder than verse ever managed. The dance around the pole, for instance, amounted to one enormous opportunity for synchronized flirting, all bundled up in ribbons and convenient deniability. And for a noble, festival courtship leaned away from hay and toward poetry. You might improvise a few lines on the spot, liken your lady's eyes to a pair of candles or some other gleaming thing, and present a small token, ideally not one your servant had obviously cobbled together moments earlier. Food was useful as well. Hand your beloved a meat pie or split a honey cake with them. A smiling acceptance meant matters were going your way. If they passed it straight to their dog, it was time to begin again with somebody else. But bear in mind, whatever you do, someone is observing. A parent, a priest, a minstrel who can't hold his tongue. A single slip, and that flirtatious grin becomes the scandal of youth dissected at church for the following 6 weeks. Even so, for a handful of hours, you can pretend. Pretend you inhabit a world where affection isn't a bargain, where a laugh draws no suspicion, and where dancing in the open doesn't conclude in penance. Suppose, though, that you're no knight, no noble, no minstrel weighed down by a lute and a surplus of feelings. You're an ordinary villager. You rise with the cattle, settle in for the night when the hens do, and pass most of your hours up to your ankles in mud. You aren't searching for some poetic counterpart to your soul. You want someone who can milk a goat without making a production of it. This was peasant courtship, where romance stayed practical, the gestures modest, and chemistry meant nothing more than we'll make it through the cold months together. In this life, courting had little to do with long talks and a great deal to do with work shared between you. You took notice of a person because they laboured hard, kept their grumbling to themselves, and had a respectable mouthful of teeth. That was the entirety of it, the whole list. You weren't fussy, you were sensible. Grand sparks weren't required. What you needed was someone who could clean a fish and ideally didn't snore at full volume. So how does one signal interest? With gifts, the small and useful sort. A basket of eggs, a bundle of kindling, a fine turnip. And if you were feeling daring, perhaps a woven ribbon or a spoon you had carved. Nothing declares serious intentions quite like a spoon whittled by candlelight while your pig watched on in silence. Talk took place over shared labour. You might walk side by side to the mill, exchange a few words while minding the sheep, or trade small talk while shoveling something of questionable odour. No one was reciting verse. You spoke of the weather, of how the crops were faring, of whether old Thomas had toppled into the well again. And yet, in its quiet fashion, it carried its own romance. There was a tenderness in the plainness of it, a shared existence founded not on grand ideals, but on working together. You came to know one another's strong points, weak points, and how quickly the other could move when a goat broke loose. Proposals tended to follow swiftly. If the two of you agreed, and the families did as well, marriage came next. And so the two of you embarked on the curious wonder of getting by from day to day. It wasn't dazzling, But it was true. You'd managed it. You'd found someone who could cook, tidy up, put up with your relatives, and didn't flinch outright at the sight of your feet. Real love, surely. Now the time arrives to wed, which in medieval terms meant stepping into a contract. Not some starlit exchange of tender promises, but a binding legal arrangement, frequently haggled over with all the warmth of a livestock sale. For a peasant, it remained a momentous thing. You assembled a handful of witnesses, spoke with the parish priest, and did your best not to stumble through the Latin midway through the rite. But underneath those gentle-sounding blessings sat a sober list of concerns: the dowry, claims to land, who came away with the cow, and what was to be done if someone died during the planting. Ah yes, romance. And if you hailed from the upper ranks, brace yourself. Your wedding amounted to a thorough legal negotiation. Your parents, theirs, the priest, the scribe, possibly a cousin who'd once dabbled in law, every one of them had a stake in it. The bride and groom were mostly there to stand about looking ornamental and nodding whenever addressed. You might never even have laid eyes on the person you were marrying. Your family had run the figures. Your estate wanted her fields. Her dowry settled your debts. And the two coats of arms looked well enough side by side. Affection was optional. The merger was not. And once the knot was tied, it held. Divorce wasn't truly an option unless you could demonstrate that someone had never been baptized, was secretly a blood relation, or had died and neglected to mention it. Annulments did exist, but they demanded heaps of paperwork, a measure of fortune, and a healthy bribe. Still, it wasn't all grim. Some couples did, in time, come to love one another. Shared chores, the raising of children, surviving one winter after another, these things have a habit of growing fondness, or at least forbearance, which in the medieval mind amounted to roughly the same thing. The church inserted itself at every stage. Marriage was a sacred rite, one of the 7 great ones. You didn't merely wed for the legalities. You wed because God required a witness, possibly a pair of them. So you stand, you trade your vows, and you smile as someone presses a sack of onions into your hands and labels it a blessing. So let us say you have had your fill. Enough of the contracts, the bargaining, the being handled like an especially prized sack of flour. You are a noble, and yet for once you wish to marry out of love, not for land, not for bloodline, not in service of your father's strategic designs, only love. Congratulations, a scandal is very much in your future. A noble elopement was the medieval equivalent of setting fire to your family tree and dancing among the embers. To run off and marry someone of your own choosing wasn't merely a private act of rebellion, it was political sabotage. Picture yourself as a lady, pledged to some baron in order to keep an estate secure, yet hopelessly taken with a penniless squire who carries the faint scent of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, murmur sweet things in the stables, and one day you slip away to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favour. There you are married under decidedly shaky legality, with only a jittery monk and a couple of chickens to witness it. Back home, uproar. Your family is furious. Your father is threatening to lay siege to the groom's family garden. Your mother weeps into her embroidery hoop. The church is gravely troubled. The gossip is exquisite. And should you be the groom in this little romantic uprising, don't grow too comfortable. In the best of cases, you keep both your bride and your kneecaps. In the worst, you are excommunicated and disemboweled in that sequence. Even so, certain couples manage to slip through. If undoing the union would only invite further embarrassment, families would sometimes merely sigh and let the matter rest. What was done was done. and at least no one had died. Hopefully. In the rarest instances, such scandals passed into legend. Songs were composed, poems written, tales murmured at banquets. Two nobles who put love ahead of duty, very nearly the stuff of myth. And yes, the vast majority of noble marriages were transactions. But these flickers, the brief rebellions, the impassioned escapes, the vows whispered beneath moonlit towers, reminded the world that love, however inconvenient, simply refused to die out. So if you ever feel a touch dramatic for declining a second outing with someone, just remember that at least your own affairs of the heart don't involve clandestine weddings, irate barons, and a horse tied to a ladder beneath your window. Ah, marriage. That lovely joining of two souls and their respective financial holdings. Because in the Middle Ages, love was pleasant enough, but a dowry, now, that was the truly romantic part. Imagine you are the bride. You aren't simply being married off. You are being launched outward like a small economic vessel fitted out with a dowry. Your family assembles it, money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or two depending on how dear they consider you, and perhaps even a set of pewter dishes if generosity strikes them. These goods pass to your future husband, who welcomes you and your portable fortune with open arms and a mind already doing arithmetic. Now turn it around. In certain cultures or regions, it isn't the bride's family handing over the goods at all. It is the bride price. The groom pays her family for the privilege of marrying her, in effect declaring, "Here is a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter." Medieval romance in full bloom. The essential point is that someone is paying someone. You are getting married, and there is most certainly a receipt somewhere in the matter. These transactions weren't only about wealth. They concerned standing, expectation, and public declaration. A generous dowry might signal that a bride came from a distinguished family. A meagre one might hint they were eager to be rid of her quickly, perhaps owing to a troubling temperament or a tendency to answer back. You, as the bride, generally didn't get to hold on to your dowry. It folded into the household economy, overseen by your husband, protected by the law, and ideally not frittered away on dice and ale within the first month of the marriage. Should the marriage come to an end through death, annulment, or your husband drifting off to join a monastery amid some midlife remorse, your dowry could in theory be handed back. But reclaiming it was often a tougher feat than drawing a sword from a stone. You would need allies, legal footing, and ideally someone who could read. The bride price, meanwhile, once paid, was rather like having bought a rare goat. Expensive at the outset and with nothing refunded. The payment made up for what the bride's family lost in helping hands, since someone, after all, still had to milk the sheep once she was gone. So although affection sometimes slipped into the arrangement, money was forever standing at the altar. Now suppose you skip marriage altogether. Perhaps you were the second-born son, or your dowry looked a touch too modest, or you simply had a genuine fondness for chanting. Whatever the reason, you've entered a monastery or convent. Congratulations. You've now pledged yourself to poverty, chastity, and a firm refusal to entertain anything resembling romance. And yet here you stand within stone walls, ringed by hushed, drifting candle smoke and the surprisingly tender gaze of Brother Anselm. Even inside cloistered grounds, forbidden affection managed to slip through the cracks. To put it plainly, developing feelings within a religious order was strongly frowned upon. The sort of frowned upon that might earn you a whipping, a banishment, or a stern talking to from a man with a Latin name. You'd vowed to surrender your heart wholly to God, which meant offering it to absolutely no other soul. But hearts rarely obey instructions, and now and then prayers begin to resemble something closer to verse. Perhaps it begins with the most ordinary of duties. A loaf handed across the refectory, a few murmured words during vespers, a laugh held a beat too long when someone fumbles a hymnal. And before the realization fully lands, you're slipping an extra wedge of cheese into Sister Beatrix's satchel and rethinking everything you thought you knew. Some monks and nuns penned ardent letters, dressed up naturally as theological reflection. A line such as "Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation" reads as devotion until one starts reading between the lines, and plenty of people did exactly that. Scandals were bound to follow, clandestine encounters among the herbs, late-night confessions of a decidedly unsacramental nature, and the occasional startling discovery of a nun whose figure had grown unexpectedly round. The consequences were generally severe: exile, public penance, or reassignment to some distant abbey remembered chiefly for its sheep and its silence. Even so, not every tale ended in shame. A handful of lovers fled. A few even wed after being released from their vows. Most, however, drifted back to their cloisters, flushed and freshly devout, insisting the entire affair had merely been a particularly heated theological discussion. Because in the end, the monastic life rested on discipline. Yet people remain people, even draped in robes, even surrounded by stillness, and at times a single quiet look across the chapel stirred more than any tournament or courtly poem ever could. And so you did it. You married. There was a priest, a roasted pig, and someone managing to spill something across your mother's one decent cloak. But a few months, perhaps a few years, have passed, and something no longer feels right. Maybe your spouse snores like a wheezing instrument. Maybe a habit of gambling went conveniently unmentioned beforehand. Or maybe it has simply dawned on you that joining two households over land and livestock does not, by itself, conjure romantic contentment. Whatever the case, you've arrived at the realm of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't reach for divorce papers, because no such thing exists, certainly nothing you'd recognize as one. Marriage was regarded as a sacred and unbreakable bond, blessed by the Church, sealed by God, and held in place by the fear of public disgrace. You'd have to demonstrate that one of you had been underage, or already married elsewhere, or too closely related, which occurred unsettlingly often, or, in the most favourable scenario, that the marriage had never been consummated, a claim that someone had to put in writing, very possibly under. An annulment was possible, but you'd need a genuinely compelling case. "We simply don't get along" would never suffice. Oath. The best of luck with that. For nobles, the tangle only grew worse. A marriage was never merely private, it was political. Attempting to break free of it might spark a feud, set off a scandal, or trigger a small war. Far safer to resent one another in silence and simply attend different feasts. So what did unhappy couples actually do? For the most part, they bore it. You took separate beds. You sighed theatrically over supper. You channeled your frustration into needlework or into one especially bitter psalm. Passive aggression became the language of love. Naturally, affairs occurred, sometimes discreetly, sometimes in spectacular fashion. Nobles kept secret companions. Peasants found suspiciously attentive neighbours. The Church condemned all of it, of course, though that hardly deterred anyone. It merely sharpened their talent for slipping around barns and crediting everything to God's mysterious will. For women, escaping a miserable marriage was harder still. Even with a violent or vanished husband, Society demanded that she stay loyal, quiet, and modestly pious, while scraping by on crusts of bread and the disapproval of others. Marriages were not always joyful, but they could harden into partnerships, shaped by hardship, by routine, and by the shared labour of hauling firewood through the rain. Now suppose your spouse dies. Perhaps the plague took them. Perhaps an accident on the farm. Perhaps they stumbled over a goose in the dark. However it came to pass, you are now widowed, and all at once the medieval pool of prospects reopens. Widowhood in the Middle Ages carried an unexpected sense of release. Not do as you please release, but distinctly more latitude than before. For women in particular, it often brought a first taste of independence, overseeing land, making one's own choices, even speaking in public without being instantly hushed. And if you were reasonably young and still in possession of your teeth, remarriage could follow quickly, very quickly indeed. Periods of mourning existed, yet so did the instinct to survive. A widow holding land and lacking a husband was, in effect, a walking treasure chest. Suitors materialized with startling speed, some heartfelt, others merely keen on the dairy cows. As a recently widowed man, you'd find society practically shoving you back toward marriage. Who, after all, was going to cook, clean, and tend to the 11 children you had somehow accumulated? So you'd begin your search. Perhaps that soft-spoken widow who always carried suspiciously fine goods to market. Romance in a second marriage could turn out unexpectedly sweet. The second time around you were older and a little wiser. You weren't being herded into an alliance, you were selecting someone to weather life beside, possibly even someone you actually liked. A remarkable idea. There were rules, of course. The church looked askance at remarriage that came too soon. The your spouse isn't even cold, yet sort of soon. And widows frequently had to haggle with relatives over dowries and inheritance. Nothing whispers romantic second chance quite like arguing with a brother-in-law over custody of the butter churn. Even so, second marriages were common, even anticipated. Life ran short, winters ran long, and no one cared to spend them alone if it could be avoided. And yes, love figured into it. Maybe not the swooning, sonnet-writing variety, but the quieter kind, grounded in shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already lived through a few things. So you lit the fire, ladled out the soup, and tried once more, not because it was flawless, but because it was human. You've come quite far now, surviving the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a rather dramatic escape from a barn. But before you give your heart to someone new, there's the most medieval question of all to consider. Are you cosmically permitted to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love was never purely a matter of the heart. It was a matter of the stars, of bones, and of whether your grandmother happened to glimpse a fox that morning. Begin with astrology. Before kissing a single soul, you might first consult the local monk astrologer. Were your signs a match? Was Venus in retrograde? Had your beloved entered the world beneath an unlucky moon? If so, better to choose someone rather less cursed. Love is taxing enough without the planets working against you. Then came birthmarks, those little mysterious symbols said to mark you as your soulmate's long-lost twin, or perhaps their destined executioner. Superstition bent whichever way it pleased. The church, meanwhile, kept its own list. You could not marry your cousin, nor your second cousin, nor your fourth cousin twice removed, unless you secured special permission, which the wealthy often simply purchased because loopholes existed. So before matters grew serious, you'd likely sketch out a family tree, then quietly smudge away certain branches. Social standing weighed heavily as well. A noble could scarcely fall for a peasant without the whole thing being branded either a miracle or a moral lapse. Romance across the classes was rare, scandalous, and tolerated only if it eventually softened into a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. A raven passing overhead while your thoughts lingered on someone, a poor sign. Dropping your bread at supper while stealing a glance at your beloved. Give it up entirely, that's a cursed match. Someone might bury a charm beneath your doorstep to shield you from unsuitable suitors, or to wreck your prospects. The same charm could serve either purpose. Love in this world was never merely personal. It was mystical. Everyone held an opinion, the stars, the saints, the weather, and that one woman out in the woods who most certainly was not a witch, though she very probably was. Yet for all the rules, the signs, and the murmured warnings, people went on loving anyway, clumsily, bravely, and frequently against all counsel, because medieval or not, the heart stays gloriously disobedient. You've likely heard of Alexander the Great, and maybe Julius Caesar too, but have you ever come across the woman said to have severed the head of Cyrus the Great and plunged it into blood? Her name was Tomiris, and she did not reign from a throne sheathed in gold or behind tall city walls. No, the open sky was her court. The wind was her army, and her power flowed not from titles, but from sheer, unbending authority. She was queen of the Massagetae, a confederation of nomadic tribes ranging across the steppes of Central Asia. Picture horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and justice delivered on the battlefield. Tomiris did not come into her power through some coddled system of courtiers. She climbed by way of grit, leadership, and quite possibly a generous measure of do-not-test-me resolve. Her people were hardened, used to brutal winters, long migrations, and foes pressing from every direction. Yet even among such a people, she stood apart. She was a warrior, a maker of laws, and a sovereign in her own right. No husband loomed over her. No brother steered her hand. To be fair, much of what survives about Tomiris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man hardly celebrated for rigorous fact-checking. But if even a sliver of his account holds true, then Tomiris was no ordinary queen. She was a storm given human shape. At the core of her story lies this: a foreign superpower swelling in strength with each passing day, the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. He had already swallowed Lydia and Babylon, and now his attention drifted eastward. The Massagetae stood next on his list. But Cyrus failed to grasp the sort of woman he was about to confront. Before a single arrow took flight, before the first spear splintered, before her son's death would change everything, Tomiris was already readying for war, not out of any hunger for conquest, but out of a refusal to submit. She was not merely guarding territory, she was guarding a way of living. And as Cyrus would shortly discover, there are certain queens you simply do not invade. Cyrus the Great carried a reputation. He was no ordinary king. He was a conqueror among conquerors, the sort of man who could walk into ancient cities, bring empires to their knees, and still earn the warm regard of historians. So when his gaze turned east toward the land of the Massagetæ, resistance was not exactly what he anticipated. After all, who would dare refuse the man who had claimed Babylon without so much as breaking a sweat? Cyrus opened with a courteous proposal, because naturally every accomplished imperialist begins with a smile. He suggested a political marriage between himself and Tomaris. You might call that romantic, but Tomaris saw straight through it. She knew this had nothing to do with love, or even genuine alliance. It was about control. Were she to marry Cyrus, her kingdom would simply become one more province of the Persian Empire, and she a trophy queen. She refused, and firmly. Cyrus, unused to being told no, took it badly. If charm would not bend her into submission, then force would seize her kingdom instead. He crossed the Araxes River, the divide between his empire and the lands of the Massagetæ, and secured a foothold. But Tomaris had not been sitting still. She rallied her warriors, took counsel from her chiefs, and made ready for what she knew was approaching: war. Then came the bait. Acting on advice from his general Harpagus, Cyrus set a clever snare. He pulled back part of his force and left behind an opulent camp, its tables piled high with wine and food, the sort of indulgences nomads almost never knew. A detachment under Tomaris's son, Sparapises, went to look it over. They overran the camp, seized the stores, and made the deadly mistake of drinking the wine. The Persians chose that precise moment to come back, finding the men intoxicated, confused, and defenseless. Sparapises and his soldiers were quickly overpowered, and he himself was taken alive. When word reached Tomaris, everything in her seemed to fracture. This was not merely a defeat on the field, it cut to the bone. Her son, the one who would inherit her place, was now held by the Persians. She dispatched a message to Cyrus, demanding that he return her son and withdraw, and warning that if he refused she would, by the sun, the lord of the Massagetæ, give him more blood than he could swallow. Cyrus ignored her. Sparapises, humiliated by his capture, ended his own life while in Persian hands. Tomaris had lost her only child, and now nothing but blood would satisfy her. Grief alone is a heavy force, but grief fused with rage is the formula for total ruin. When she learned her son had died in captivity, something within her gave way completely. The matter was no longer about boundaries, or pride, or even sovereignty. It had become a war steeped in revenge, and Tomaris was not a woman to mourn in silence. She did not withdraw into her tent in mourning robes, or sit weeping beside the fire. Instead, she climbed onto her horse, put an edge to her weapons, and made a vow that would carry down the centuries. She would meet Cyrus in battle. She would beat him. And she would see to it that he never forgot her name, not even in death. By Herodotus's account, Tomaris called together her tribal council, and at her word the Massagetæ assembled for war. Picture the scene. Hundreds of riders on horseback, clad in leather armor, carrying bows and spears, their faces set with fury. They did not advance in the orderly manner of a Persian army. They came on like a storm, fast, unpredictable, and lethally exact. This time the trap was hers to set. Cyrus, perhaps grown overconfident after his earlier ruse, misjudged how unyielding she could be. But Tomaris had taken his measure by now. She watched his maneuvers, held back until the moment was right, and then threw everything she had against him. The two forces collided in what Herodotus calls one of the bloodiest clashes of the ancient world. There were no elegant formations, no lengthy orations, only shrieking horses, ringing blades, and a queen who fought shoulder to shoulder with her warriors. This was no empress draped in silk. Tamiris was in the heart of the fighting, riding hard, striking down her enemies with cold determination. And once the dust came to rest, Cyrus the Great lay dead. Tamiris, always one for a fitting gesture of justice, had his body sought out. His head was cut away, lowered into a skin filled with blood, and offered up as a final reckoning. As Herodotus tells it, she spoke to it, saying he had thirsted for blood, and now he could drink his fill. Whether every detail holds up hardly seems to matter, because the essential thing is that Tamiris prevailed. She brought down the mightiest empire of her age, avenged her son, and ensured that she would be remembered not as a victim but as a conqueror. And this was only the beginning of her legend. The battlefield fell quiet. The Persians were dead or in flight, their fabled king lying lifeless in the dirt. And Tamiris did not rejoice in the way a conqueror might. She held no triumphal march through Persepolis and stamped her face on no coins. She simply stood over the body of Cyrus, her vengeance complete, and yet her heart still in pieces. Victory, as it happened, brought no peace with it. The Massagetae had won far more than a single battle. They had shifted the course of empire. In Babylon, in Egypt, and out to the distant edges of the Persian domain, the talk spread that the king who could not be stopped had fallen, and not to some rival empire, but to a nomad queen with no throne and no palace, possessing only fury, toughness, and a cavalry of warriors who would have. The fall of Cyrus the Great rippled outward across the ancient world, followed her into the fire. Even so, Tamiris did not turn her victory into a campaign of conquest. She went home to her people with the same plain practicality that marked her rule. There were no war levies, no imperial designs. She made no move to seize the Persian throne. That simply was not her world. Justice had been done. Her son had been avenged. The empire could carry on without Cyrus, but from now on it would hesitate before turning eastward again. It is worth pausing on how unusual this was. Most rulers, having won a battle of that scale, would have seized power with both hands. Yet Tamiris seemed far more interested in safeguarding her people's freedom than in widening her own reach, and it is here that her story starts to dim. Nothing is recorded of her after the battle. There are no statues, no royal tomb, no Massagetae monuments cut into stone. She rides off into the haze of history, as hard to pin down and as wild as the steppe itself. Historians argue over whether Herodotus embellished her tale. Some hold that Cyrus died somewhere else, that the blood-filled skin was simply a poetic flourish. But even the doubters concede that someone dealt Persia a severe blow, and that it was not a king and not a general, but a queen, a mother, a woman whose love for her son drove one of the most dramatic reckonings of the ancient world. Her story did not need to be set in stone. It travelled on the wind. For some still say that when the wind cries across the steppe, it carries her name within it. To make sense of Tamiris, one has to make sense of the people she led. The Massagetae were nothing like the usual ancient civilization. There were no marble temples, no terraced gardens, no scrolls of verse. They were a nomadic warrior people who lived in the vast, untamed country east of the Caspian Sea, lands too wild for Persian governors or Babylonian clerks. Theirs was a life of movement, survival, and honor. Their bows were short and deadly, their armor built of leather and scale, supple enough for riding and tough enough for combat. They hunted, they raided, and they fought to keep their freedom. And unlike many of the male-dominated societies of that era, among the Massagete women could fight, and they did. This was not some exception to the rule. It was simply expected. Warrior women were not the stuff of legend here. They were the people next door. So when Tamiris took up a blade and led her people to war, no one was surprised. She was not playing at being a man or breaking with custom. She was the custom, only keener, shrewder, and a good deal more dangerous than most. Their society prized strength, but it prized justice as well. Wrongdoing was punished severely, yet evenly. In many respects, property was held in common. What counted was loyalty to the tribe and the capacity to defend it. Kings and queens did rule, yes, but by consensus rather than tyranny. Leaders had to earn their standing through deeds, not through bloodlines. As for their faith, they were worshippers of the sun. Tamiris, in her famous warning to Cyrus, swore by the sun, the lord of the Massagetae. The sun stood for life, for light, and for justice, the divine arbiter of every oath. To go back on one's word was to insult the heavens themselves. In short, Tamiris was no anomaly. She was the very embodiment of her people's ideal, fierce, principled, and proud. She did not climb to power despite being a woman. She climbed because she was exactly the sort of leader the Massagetae held in esteem. Where the Persians had bureaucracy, the Massagetae had freedom. And in one brutal, history-shaping encounter, that freedom held firm. Because when you come from a land where the wind never rests and the sky is your only roof, surrender is simply not a choice. Here is something curious. Nearly everything we know of Tamiris, her struggle with Cyrus, the death of her son, the skin filled with blood, traces back to a single man, Herodotus. Herodotus is often called the father of history, which sounds impressive until you remember that he is just as much the father of hearsay, myth, and dramatic flourish. The man loved a good tale, and if that tale featured divine omens, gruesome revenge, or a queen thrusting a head into blood, so much the better. So how much of her story is true? That hinges on how far you trust a Greek who wrote decades after the events and had almost certainly never met a single member of the Massagetae. Herodotus leaned on second-hand reports, the stories of travellers, and whatever rumours happened to be drifting through the Persian Empire. To him, history was not merely a record, it was a performance. Still, consider this. He chose to tell her story. In a world crowded with male warlords, tyrants, and kings, Herodotus went to the trouble of putting a steppe queen in the spotlight, one who had toppled one of the greatest rulers in history. That is not a small thing. But let us step back. Why did this tale travel so far? Because it had everything. A noble woman, a tragic son, a cunning adversary, a fight to the death, and a grisly ending worthy of any Greek tragedy. If you had lived in Athens or Thebes and caught this story from a wandering bard, you would have remembered Tamiris for the rest of your days, not because she wore a crown, but because she dared to stand against a superpower and won. And in time, her story changed shape. Medieval chronicles cast her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists showed her soaked in blood, holding the head of Cyrus like a prize. She was exotic, fearsome, unforgettable. Yet through all the retellings, something genuine still clings to her legend. Perhaps not the exact words, perhaps not the skin of blood, but the framework of the story, the queen, the sun, the war, the victory, feels too particular and too human to be wholly invented. In the end, Herodotus did more than preserve Tamiris. He turned her into myth. And while that may smudge the line between fact and fiction, it also made certain that her name would outlast the imperial decrees of Cyrus by a wide margin, because history forgets its generals, but it remembers vengeance. For a queen who left behind no monuments, Tamiris has gripped the imagination of empires for more than 2,000 years. Renaissance painters were devoted to her. She made a striking subject, ideal for the bloody climax of a canvas. In 1622, Rubens painted her calmly holding a severed head as courtiers looked on in wonder. In another work, she stands poised and regal, while the cut-off head of Cyrus is ceremonially lowered into a golden vessel brimming with blood. Tasteful, perhaps not. Memorable, certainly. To European artists, Tamiris was more than a figure out of history. She was symbolism made flesh, a woman who punished arrogance, a noble savage, a cautionary tale, a feminist emblem depending on whose hand held the brush. She might stand for the righteous anger of a mother, the savagery of the East, or the wisdom of a ruler who could not be bought. Writers were taken with her too. Across the 18th and 19th centuries she turned up in plays, in novels, and in philosophical writings. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether she proved that women could govern wisely, or whether she served as a warning of what comes when emotion drives leadership. Either way, she remained in print. Yet oddly, her own people left nothing behind. The Massagetae slipped out of history, absorbed or erased by the nomadic cultures that followed. There are no carved inscriptions, no burial mounds with gold plaques announcing that Tamiris was here. Her memory survived entirely through the eyes of outsiders. And still, she kept resurfacing. In Soviet-era Central Asia, she was reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against imperialism. Statues of her rose in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Modern scholars looked at her again, not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate head of state, a woman who ruled, who led armies, and who negotiated from a position of strength. She has shown up in everything from documentaries to video games. In one place, she is a playable leader in a strategy game. In another, she is the subject of academic journals on gender and power. That is range. And here is the strange part. We still don't even know what she looked like. No coins survive, no busts, no carvings bearing her face. Yet we know exactly what she represented. Strength, retribution, self-rule, and the weight of a name passed down. In a world that quietly forgets the queens who played by the rules, Tamiris lingers in memory precisely because she refused to. She never requested a quiet spot in history's gallery of polite portraits. She broke the door off its hinges and stood for the bloodiest portrait ever made. Tamiris was not the first woman to march fighters into battle, and she was far from the last. But history has a habit of treating women like her as anomalies, lone sparks of power flickering inside a world run by men. The reality is different. Tamiris belonged to a long and frequently ignored line of women who governed with a blade in hand. Let's step backward for a moment. Before her, there was Shamaramut, the Assyrian queen who may have given rise to the legendary Semiramis, founder of cities, crusher of rebellions. In roughly the same age, the Scythians, cultural relatives of the Massagetae, buried female fighters alongside their weapons, their bones still carrying the unmistakable marks of combat. These were not decorative honours. These women fought, were wounded, and died in the saddle. And after Tamiris, the line continued. Boudica, the Celtic queen who launched a blazing uprising against Rome in the 1st century, is often set beside her. As with Tomyris, Boudica's war grew out of private grief. Her daughters were harmed, her territory taken. Her answer was to reduce Roman settlements to ash. The echoes are striking. Sorrow turned to vengeance against an empire too proud to notice the danger gathering at its edge. Then there is Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, who in the 3rd century stood against Rome and shaped a small empire of her own in the east. She struck coins bearing her own face. She proclaimed independence. She forced the emperor to travel to her. What ties all these women together, Tomyris among them, is not power alone, it is nerve. They led in ages that insisted command belonged to men. They held authority not as caretakers or temporary fill-ins, but as planners, commanders and sovereigns. And while countless male leaders earned praise for their conquests, these women were branded dangerous, unnatural, savage. The reason was simple. They won. Tomyris was no exception to the rule. She was one thread in a worldwide pattern, stretching across centuries, of women who rose during emergencies and made kings bleed. Her tale, kept alive by Greek writers and the modern imagination, reminds us that female leadership was never truly scarce. It was simply seldom recorded. So when ancient warfare comes to mind, the image need not be only helmets and beards. There is also a queen on horseback, bow drawn, fury in her gaze, and the understanding that Tomyris stood among many. She was just one of the rare few who could not be wiped from memory. She never raised a palace. She left behind no gilded inscriptions, no dynastic walls. There is no grand tomb, no surviving armor, no marble likeness resting in a museum. And still she lasts. In several ways, her legacy is a contradiction. Her whole story rests on a few paragraphs from Herodotus, slanted, embellished, perhaps even invented. Yet those words dropped a seed that would not wither. For more than 2,000 years, her name has surfaced again and again, in moments when the world needed reminding that power does not always arrive wearing a crown or a beard. She has been reshaped through endless lenses. To Renaissance Europe, she became the noble savage, a caution aimed at tyrants. To modern Central Asia, she turned into a folk hero, an emblem of resistance and national pride, especially in nations still wrestling with colonial and imperial histories. Statues of her stand in the plazas of Kazakhstan. School children learn her name. Politicians borrow her words when they speak of strength and independence. But beneath the symbolism and the myth lies something deeply human. It is the story of a mother who lost her son. It is the story of a ruler pressed to choose between surrender and survival. It is the story of a person who, cornered by one of the mightiest powers the world had yet seen, chose to fight and prevailed. In a world that so often erases the names of warrior women, Tomyris remains, like a blade resting just under the surface, always waiting to be lifted again by a new generation hungry for tales of unbroken defiance. She reminds us that history is not only kings and empires. It is also mothers and queens, grief and revenge, dirt and blood. It is the hushed stretch of time after a battle, when a woman stands alone in a field strewn with the fallen, aware that she has bent the course of the world, yet knowing she may never be fully believed. And perhaps that is her finest legacy, the refusal to be forgotten. No statues, no matter. Her name still travels on the wind of the steppe, her story still makes emperors seem mortal, and her legend still murmurs its warning, "Come for me, and you will drink your fill." So the next time you hear of a great king's undoing, recall that sometimes the last blow lands not from a rival empire, but from a queen on horseback, lost to history, yet never truly gone. Picture a way of living where the walls are made of felt, the roof is sewn from hide, and the front door opens onto the horizon itself. No cities, no farmland, no stone monuments left for the future. Only the steady beat of hooves, the soft sound of grass, and a sky in constant change. For the ancient nomadic peoples, permanence was an illusion, and movement was strength. From the Eurasian steppe to the Arabian deserts, ancient nomads built whole civilizations without raising a single marble temple. They were not aimless drifters. They were deliberate movers, guided by the seasons, by the grazing habits of their herds, and by a close, lived knowledge of the land. Their dwellings were yurts, tents, or wagons on wheels, foldable strongholds made for a life in motion. Cattle, sheep, goats, and above all horses, form the foundations of nomadic life. A person's wealth was measured in animals, not acreage. Horses were far more than tools. They were companions, weapons, and marks of status. To ride well was to stay alive. To ride best was to command. But mobility did not mean disorder. Nomadic societies carried intricate social structures. Power usually ran through clans and tribes, with leadership often grounded in merit and influence rather than rigid bloodlines. A chief or khan might rise on the strength of tactical skill, persuasive speech, or sheer presence. Loyalty was personal, won at fireside councils and on wind-scoured battlefields. And rather than being cut off from the wider world, the nomads were its connective thread. They carried silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and captives from Europe. Nomadic caravans and traders were the first transcontinental couriers, long before settled empires understood the routes. And when trade collapsed, they raided, quick, calculated, and frighteningly effective. Their history was not chiseled into stone. It was sung, recited, and held in memory. Elders handed down legends and laws through oral tradition. An entire tribe's legal code, history, and identity could live within the mind of a single bard or elder. Stories were never mere amusement. They were instruction, governance, and identity all at once. To the empires, nomads looked unpredictable, foreign, and dangerous. To themselves, they were keepers of freedom, masters of adaptation, and inheritors of the wind. They left few ruins behind, but they reshaped the world each time they rode. Long before the Mongols rolled across Eurasia, the Scythians held the wind-swept steppe. Between the 9th and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, these nomadic warriors dominated the lands reaching from the Black Sea to the fringes of Central Asia. To the Greeks, they were terrifying riders and exotic barbarians. To themselves, they were a people defined by freedom, vengeance, and pride. Scythian society was organized around movement and warfare. Their weapons were practical and lethal, short composite bows ideal for shooting at a full gallop, curved swords, battle axes, and iron-tipped spears. And the Scythian warrior was not always a man. Archaeological discoveries confirm what Herodotus only hinted at. Women fought as well. Certain graves hold female skeletons buried with weapons, bearing wounds that could only have come from genuine combat. They built no cities, but their kurgans, the burial mounds, have kept their legacy intact. Beneath these mounds, archaeologists have uncovered gold, intricate tattoos on preserved skin, embroidered clothing, and ornate weaponry. Their art, alive with swirling animals and predatory imagery, mirrors a life tied to nature and the hunt. But the Scythians were more than wild raiders. They were diplomats, hired soldiers, and merchants, especially with the Greek colonies along the Black Sea, where they sold furs, captives, and grain, and imported wine, pottery, and luxury goods in return. Greek writers both admired and feared them. Herodotus described their unusual customs, drinking the blood of enemies or treating scalps as cloths, yet he also commended their sense of justice and their devotion to kin. Their religion was primal and animistic. They honored gods of war, fire, and fertility. Some rituals involved cannabis smoke, others the sacrifice of horses. Their view of the world was cyclical and bound to the land, not as something owned, but as a path of sacred movement. In time, they faded. Squeezed by other nomadic groups such as the Sarmatians, and hemmed in by expanding empires, the Scythians dissolved into the past. But they had set the mold for the steppe warrior, a mobile, deadly, fiercely independent fighter answering to no master and tied to no fixed home. They wrote no books. Yet when you picture a mounted archer outlined against the steppe, that silhouette is Scythian. They were the storm that came before the empire. While the Scythians ruled the grasslands, the Bedouin carved their legacy into sand. Rising from the immense deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin were not simply wanderers. They were engineers of survival, mastering some of the harshest terrain on earth. Unlike the mounted thunder of the steppe nomads, Bedouin life was quieter and more measured. It moved to the rhythms of the desert, drought and rainfall, grazing routes, and the shifting of the stars. Their home was the black goat hair tent, the Beit al-Shah, portable, breathable, and easy to fold away. Life travelled with the camels, the ships of the desert. A camel was transport, food, clothing, and currency all in one. The Bedouin were renowned for their tribal order. Everything centered on the clan. Loyalty to kin came before all else. Honor, or sharaf, was not merely a word. It was the social glue that held everything together. A single insult could ignite a blood feud, yet generosity toward guests, karam, was held just as sacred. A stranger could count on food, water, and protection for 3 days, no questions asked. Their warfare was built around the raid, the gazu, swift and calculated strikes meant to seize goods and livestock without needless bloodshed. Battle was not about mass slaughter. It was about survival, prestige, and honor. A successful raid lifted a man's standing. A failed one could stain a tribe's name for generations. But Bedouin life was not only conflict and sandstorms, it was rich in oral tradition. Poets were warriors armed with words. Their verses preserved history, shamed rivals, and exalted heroes. Poetry passed from memory to memory, often delivered in a song-like cadence around the fire. Some poems hardened into tribal lore, others became legacy. Trade caravans, too, threaded through Bedouin lands. These tribesmen acted as guides, protectors, and at times smugglers, carrying goods such as incense, spices, and silk from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond. They knew every oasis and every path among the stars. Their knowledge was famous and costly. Though many Bedouin later folded into cities and empires, they kept a fierce sense of who they were. Even now, the black tent and the tribal code stand as emblems of Bedouin pride. They were not merely survivors of the desert, they were its very soul. No nomadic people has ever reshaped the world quite like the Mongols. In the 13th century, these steppe riders burst out of the plains of Mongolia and assembled the largest contiguous land empire in history. Yet their origins were no different from the nomadic cultures they followed: mobile, plan-based, and fiercely adaptive. Life on the Mongolian steppe was harsh and demanding. The Mongols lived in gur, circular felt tents that could be raised in under an hour and loaded onto a cart the next morning. Their herds were everything to them: horses, yaks, goats, all of it kept them fed and clothed, and the children among them grew up on horseback. A child learned to ride long before learning to read, and the truth is that most Mongols never read at all, yet this was no handicap. What they needed to know lived in their songs, their sayings, and their memories. The thing that set the Mongols apart was the way they turned movement itself into a weapon. Under Genghis Khan, the old tribal boundaries were broken apart and rebuilt into a structure that rewarded ability rather than birth. People no longer answered to their clan but to the Khan, and from that simple shift, the course of history bent. The way the Mongols fought resembled a kind of choreography, built on speed and trickery. Their mounted archers could loose arrows accurately while riding at a full run, stage false retreats to draw an enemy out of position, and cover more than 100 miles in a single day. Yet they were never mere raiders. They were planners. They relied on scouts, informers, signal flags, and the careful sowing of fear, and they did all of it with unsettling skill. As they began to take cities, they learned fast. Siege specialists from China and Persia were folded into their armies, and from them the Mongols picked up the making of catapults, fire arrows, and battering rams, which they then used with cold effectiveness. And here lies the surprise. They were not only a force of ruin. The empire they built stitched the world together in a way no one had managed before. They restored and guarded the Silk Road, making it safe to travel from China all the way to Europe. Across that immense web moved trade goods, fresh ideas, and even sickness, including the Black Death. They brought in paper money, a system of travel documents, and a broad tolerance of different faiths. A Muslim trader, a Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk could each journey in safety beneath Mongol authority, provided none of them rose in revolt. And still, at heart, they stayed nomads. Even while ruling vast lands, the Mongol lords kept returning to their tents, their herds, and the open grassland. They took cities, but the cities were never truly theirs. However high they rose, they always rode with the wind behind them. In the eyes of the settled empires, nomads were either a useful asset or a looming threat, and frequently both at once. But to the nomads themselves, the boundary between trading and raiding was something that could be bargained over. One day they might guide your caravans safely across the sands. The next, they might strip your border towns bare. It came down to the mood, the time of year, and how generously you had paid. Trade mattered enormously to the nomadic way of life. Most nomads could neither grow grain nor shape pottery, so they needed tools, cloth, spices, and finer goods from elsewhere. In return, they offered livestock, furs, leather, salt, and prized rarities such as falcons or unusual horses. Some dealt straight with the empires. Others worked as go-betweens, linking far-apart regions, becoming vital threads along the Silk Road, the incense route, and other paths that crossed whole continents. But these were no plain merchant trains. They were armed columns, prepared either to defend themselves or to strike, depending on the moment. A tribal chief might sit down with a border governor one week and empty his granaries the next. The empires named this betrayal. The nomads simply called it keeping their choices open. The Scythians, for instance, traded grain and gold with the Greek towns ringing the Black Sea, but should a town try to swindle them, they put it to the torch. The Bedouins guarded the incense and spice caravans crossing Arabia, unless a fee went unpaid, at which point the camels turned the other way. The Mongols under Genghis Khan at first sought ordinary peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire. But once their merchants were put to death, they answered by wiping whole cities from the map. To the nomadic way of thinking, trade was both personal and political. It was never only commerce. It stood as a measure of respect. When a settled kingdom met the nomads as equals, business flourished. When it slighted them, retribution came quickly, and it usually arrived on horseback. Out of this strain grew a curious arrangement, the border economies. Towns sitting at the edge of nomadic country often turned into mixed places, part garrison and part marketplace. Governors slipped bribes to chieftains. Tribes brought news, horses, and information to trade. Now and then a marriage was arranged to hold a fragile peace together. This back and forth between trade and raid was not a defect in nomadic life. It was the design. It let them bargain for power without holding territory, sway empires without constructing one, and stay nimble in a world that prized its walls. They had no need to seize cities. They only needed cities to keep their eyes fixed on the horizon. In a world without libraries, scrolls, or printing presses, how does a people hold on to its past? For the nomadic cultures, the answer was plain and remarkably strong. You remember it. For these ancient peoples, oral tradition was far more than a way to tell stories. It served at once as their library, their court of law, their constitution, and their body of myth. From the Scythian grasslands to the Mongol plains and the Bedouin deserts, memory was held sacred and the tongue cut deeper than any blade. The elders were far more than aged men and women. They were living archives. They carried lineages reaching back a dozen generations, the war stories that gave a tribe its sense of itself, and the proverbs that steered choices in calm times and in conflict alike. These were not idle tales, spun for entertainment around a fire. They were lessons, warnings, and laws. Among the Bedouins, poetry reigned supreme. A finely turned verse could disgrace a foe, honor a fallen fighter, or put an end to a quarrel. The poets, the shaudir, advised tribal leaders and were recalled more vividly than many a chief. Their words could spark a war or halt one in its tracks, and their recall was faultless. Whole epics were handed down word for word, one generation to the next. The Mongols were the same. The famous work, called The Secret History of the Mongols, was first kept alive by mouth, and only set down in writing much later. It records not merely the rise of Genghis Khan, but the cultural ideals of loyalty, fate, vengeance, and ambition that shaped their world. It reads as no dry chronicle. It is a living saga, first spoken from memory to instruct and to bind a people together. Even the Scythians, who left almost nothing in writing, kept careful spoken accounts of their migrations, their battles, and their alliances. When Greek writers such as Herodotus set down their tales, they were catching the echoes of a far older spoken inheritance, history carried through firelight rather than carved into stone. Oral tradition carried its dangers, memories dimmed, and stories shifted over time. Yet it held one tremendous strength. It was alive. It could bend, adapt, and stay deeply human. It allowed nomadic societies to keep their identity even after migrations, defeats, or absorption into other cultures. Empires might collapse and their archives crumble to dust, but the nomadic stories endured, not because someone wrote them down, but because they were woven into breath. And as long as a single person remembered, nothing was ever truly gone. In many of the old civilizations, women were kept to the margins, silent, veiled, or shut away behind palace walls. In the nomadic societies, though, the picture was frequently quite different. When a whole community is on the move, everyone labours, and that meant women carried real power too. From the Scythians to the Mongols, the findings of archaeology and the records of history alike show that nomadic women were never only mothers and wives. They were riders, fighters, shamans, envoys, and leaders of clans. A life in motion left no room for idle hands. Each member of the community, whatever their sex, had to add something to survival, to warfare, and to governance. These were not ceremonial gestures. These women fought. Greek historians were so fascinated and so unnerved that they spun whole legends about the Amazons, fierce warrior women said to spring from these very nomadic tribes. In Mongol society, the women ran the camps, while the men were off raiding or campaigning. But even at the summit of power, women left their imprint. The daughters and daughters-in-law of Genghis Khan often governed provinces, commanded armies, and carried out diplomacy. One of the most formidable women in Mongol history, Sorghutani Beki, was a strategist and a maker of kings who raised emperors and arranged alliances. Among the Bedouins, women held fewer public posts of leadership, yet they still shaped events through poetry, family ties, and the sacred customs of hospitality. A woman's tent was her own realm. Her skill at managing resources, upholding honour, and raising the next generation of warriors made her central to the life of the tribe. In some tribes, a woman could begin a divorce, hold property, and even own camels, the supreme mark of wealth and survival. Religion, too, granted nomadic women a spiritual standing. Across various Turkic and Siberian steppe cultures, female shamans took on vital roles as healers, as guides to the spirit world, and as keepers of the wisdom of the ancestors. They were no fringe mystics. They were honoured supports of the community. Put simply, mobility bred necessity, and necessity gave rise to a degree of equality, at least more than most empires of the age allowed. The uncertain rhythm of nomadic life demanded adaptability. If a man fell in battle, a woman stepped into his place with no ceremony and no need to ask leave. In these windswept societies, one woman might be both the hand that rocked the cradle and the hand that drew the bow. For the nomadic peoples, the spiritual was not bound to temples or holy buildings. It was threaded through the land, the sky, and the act of travelling itself. When a life is always in motion, the gods travel along. Nomadic belief tended to be animistic and rooted in nature, drawn from the turning of the seasons, the ways of animals, and the demands of staying alive. The wind was not simply weather, it was a messenger. Mountains stood as guardians, rivers bore spirits along, fire was sacred. To live was to hold a conversation with what could not be seen. Among the Scythians, as Herodotus described them, worship gathered around a set of gods linked to the natural world. Tabiti, goddess of the hearth, likely a counterpart to Hestia, and Papaios, god of the sky. Their rituals often featured the sacrifice of horses, the smoke of cannabis, and oaths sworn beneath the open heavens. Their spiritual world was raw, earthy, and immediate. There were no priests in fine robes, only warriors and shamans calling out to the skies. The Bedouins, before Islam arose, followed a kind of polytheism built around local gods and tribal idols. Above all, though, they held in awe the unseen, the mysterious workings of fate and of nature. The jinn, or spirits, were thought to live in rocks, in windstorms, and in lonely places. Poets and seers were believed to be inspired, and at times even possessed, by these beings. Hospitality was not merely a custom, it was a spiritual duty. In Mongol culture, the spiritual order revolved around Tengrism, the worship of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri was not a god one prayed to inside a temple. He was the sky itself, always present, watching and weighing. Genghis Khan held that his right to rule flowed from Tengri. The Mongols also honored earth spirits, the ghosts of ancestors, and the sacred fire at the center of every tent. Shamanism was woven through all of it. Shamans served as healers, as guides among the spirits, and as advisors in matters of state. The strength of nomadic spirituality lay in how readily it could adapt. As nomads encountered Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others, they often mingled those faiths with their own. Mongol emperors gave their support to several religions at the same time. A Bedouin might keep Islamic law while still holding to older customs born of the desert. Where cities raised temples to house the divine, the nomads carried the sacred along with them. Their gods moved, their rituals reshaped themselves, and their beliefs ran like the very rivers they forded. For to a nomad, faith asked for no four walls, only the sky overhead, the earth underfoot, and memory held between them. They left behind no pyramids and no cathedrals. Their capitals appear on no modern map. And yet the mark of the ancient nomadic cultures runs all through history, in the movement of trade, the wounds of conquest, and even the languages now spoken. The nomads were no mere footnotes. They were architects of upheaval, reshaping whole continents through sheer movement. The Silk Road was never just a route for silk and spices. It was a thoroughfare laid down by hooves and kept open by the diplomacy, the strength, and the local knowledge of the nomadic tribes. Without them, East and West might never have come together. The empires dreaded them, and with reason. The Scythians, the Xiongnu, the Turks, and the Mongols all struck at the comforting belief that the city stood supreme. Their triumphs laid bare a basic truth. Mobility can outthink monuments. Where empires lumbered, nomads adjusted. When cities leaned on walls, nomads leaned on speed. But their influence was never only a matter of war. They served as bridges between cultures, carrying music, recipes, stories, and even religion from one world into another. Mongol rule brought Chinese printing methods to Persia. Arab Bedouin traditions helped shape the early Islamic world, from its language and law to its poetry and its codes of honor. Turkish nomads set the foundation on which the Ottoman Empire would later rise. The trails they followed on horseback turned into the lifelines of whole civilizations. Long after their realms dissolved, something of them lingered. It survives in the way people still ride, in cultures that pass knowledge down by voice rather than ink, and in the prizing of family ties, toughness, and self-reliance that continues to ripple across steppe, desert, and tundra. In a sense, they also stand as a caution. They remind us that nothing built by human hands lasts forever, not even the mightiest empire. They showed that the wind itself could rub out a border, and that power need not be set in stone to be genuine. Nomadic peoples are still here today, though their numbers have thinned and they often live under strain from modern frontiers, shifting climate, and the spread of cities. Even so, their descendants hold to customs older than most countries, welcoming strangers into their tents, honouring the animals they depend on, and carrying tales that travel down the years like horses moving through fog. So when history is studied, it is worth looking past the walls, the temples, the thrones, and noticing the spaces in between. That is where the nomads made their lives, and that is where so much of history was actually set in motion. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States was split apart not only by its politics but by the land itself. The eastern half hummed with cities, factories, and busy harbours. The western half was a sprawling wilderness of mountains, deserts, and gold country. Stretching between them lay more than 1,700 miles of punishing terrain. Travelling from New York to California meant weeks at sea sailing around Cape Horn, or months in a wagon while contending with sickness, thieves, and endless dust. Still, the dream persisted. A railroad that could stitch the country together, one steel rail at a time, a single line running from one ocean to the other. To some it seemed impossible, to others simply a matter of time. Those who believed in it argued it could bind the Republic, quicken communication, carry troops, unlock fresh markets, and bring settlement to the wild frontier. Building it, though, demanded far more than ambition. It called for money, workers, land, and political muscle, and that last ingredient arrived with the Civil War. In 1862, even as the nation was tearing at its own seams, Abraham Lincoln put his signature to the Pacific Railway Act. The law gave two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, permission to begin laying track from opposite ends of the continent. The Union Pacific would press westward out of Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific worked eastward from Sacramento, California, the two of them meeting somewhere in the middle. To pay for the effort, the government handed over enormous grants of land. For every mile of track set down, each company could claim as much as 640 acres of public land, along with generous loans. And so the contest began, not merely to join the country together, but to seize land, wealth, and a place in history. On paper, it read like a triumph of engineering. In practice, it was about to become one of the most punishing building projects the country had ever attempted. Crews would blast their way through mountains, span great open plains, and endure harsh winters and blistering deserts. Thousands of immigrants and labourers would be gathered to carry out the work. The payoff would be immense, and so would the toll in human lives. And for the indigenous nations whose lands the rails would slice across like a wound, this was not progress at all. It was a warning. In 1862, the whole idea still felt like a wager. Yet within 7 years, two lines would join in the Utah desert and reshape America for good. The Union Pacific had the level plains of Nebraska laid out before it, but the Central Pacific ran straight into a far crueler obstacle from the outset, the Sierra Nevada. These were not rolling hills. They were soaring granite peaks, plagued by avalanches, deep snowdrifts, and terrain that broke the backs of those who worked it. And all of this came before dynamite had even been invented. Construction got underway in Sacramento in 1863, but the true barrier rose only about 80 miles to the east. The Sierras stood like a wall, and each mile of track gained felt like a battle waged against nature itself. To overcome it, the Central Pacific needed labour, and an enormous amount of it. Early on, the company took on mostly Irish immigrants and white labourers, but many walked away, unable or unwilling to endure such brutal conditions. It was then that the company turned to a different workforce, Chinese immigrants. By 1865, more than 10,000 Chinese labourers were at work on the line, making up over 80% of the entire Central Pacific workforce. They were paid less than white workers, frequently housed in more hazardous quarters, and met with deep prejudice. Yet they proved irreplaceable, displaying remarkable skill, stamina, and discipline. Their work was both heroic and terrible. They cut tunnels through solid rock with nothing but hand tools and black powder. The most notorious of these, Tunnel Number 6, took close to 2 years to finish. In winter, the drifts climbed to 40 feet, and crews lived in camps buried under the snow, linked by vertical shafts that rose like chimneys. Dozens lost their lives in avalanches, blasts, and rock slides. And still the line crept forward. To gain ground faster, Chinese crews lowered themselves in baskets over the edges of cliffs, chiseling at the stone bit by bit. When a mountain could not be skirted, they bored through it. When the ground could not be leveled, they raised wooden trestles that arched high above the ravines. It was some of the most dangerous and least appreciated labor in the country's history. Hardly any records survive of the individual Chinese workers. No statues were raised in their honor in those days. But without their hands, the dream of crossing the continent would have perished in the Sierras. By 1867, the Central Pacific at last broke free of the mountains. Ahead lay desert, dry and merciless and lethal, but flat. The hardest stretch was behind them, and the race to the meeting point was truly underway. While the Central Pacific wrestled with granite and snow in the west, the Union Pacific had its own ordeal to face. Setting out from Omaha, Nebraska, the company laid track westward across the Great Plains, a country that seemed to go on forever, flat and deceptively easy. But the difficulty was never really the land. It was people, politics, and power. The Union Pacific hired mostly Irish immigrants, former Union soldiers and freed men, many of them veterans seeking steady wages once the Civil War had ended. Crews could put down 2 and sometimes 3 miles of track in a single day. The wide open plains allowed for speed, but they also left the workers exposed to raids, hunger, and harsh extremes of weather. This was indigenous land. The Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux had hunted, lived, and been buried on these plains for countless generations. To them, the railroad was no kind of progress. It was an invasion. The track ran straight through tribal hunting grounds. The smoke-belching engines scattered the buffalo herds. Telegraph poles and surveying parties intruded on sacred places. The tribes could see what lay ahead: the settlers, the soldiers, the fences, and the loss of their homeland. Resistance was certain. The Lakota Sioux, under leaders such as Red Cloud, fought back with fierce determination. They struck at camps, attacked surveying teams, and pulled up the rails. In answer, the United States government raised forts along the route and posted troops to protect the line. Building the railroad turned into a military operation, with track layers working under the watch of armed guards. It was a slow-burning war fought with rifles and with treaties that never held. For the indigenous nations, the railroad amounted to a death sentence for their entire way of life, and in that they were right. Even so, the Union Pacific kept pushing on. Backed by huge federal loans and directed by men like Thomas Durant, the company laid track at a furious pace. The crews lived in makeshift towns nicknamed Hell on Wheels, which appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. Gambling, whiskey, and violence trailed the workers like a dust storm. By 1867, the Union Pacific had reached Cheyenne and was pressing on into Wyoming. The mountains loomed far off, but the steeper climb in front of them was a political one. How do you knit a nation together while laying rails over the bones of another? For the Union Pacific, the answer was a simple one: lay the track and never look back. The tale of the Transcontinental Railroad tends to be told in terms of golden spikes and important men in top hats. But the real story is steeped in sweat, muscle, and pain, much of it supplied by men whose names were never written down, whose graves were never marked, and whose lives were buried beneath the very tracks they laid. On the Central Pacific, it was the Chinese laborers who did what seemed impossible. Nearly 15,000 of them, most coming from Guangdong province, withstood freezing weather, deadly explosions, and racial hatred as they tunneled through the Sierra Nevada. They earned less than white workers, received no recognition, and were often kept in separate, inferior camps. Yet they kept at it, quietly, skillfully, and without letting up. Though early doubters had dismissed them as weak and unsuited to the task, the Chinese crews soon proved to be the most dependable workforce on the entire railroad. They blasted rock, set rail, built trestles, and prepared their own meals, frequently staying healthier than those around them. And yet, when the final spike was hammered home at Promontory Point, not one of them was asked to join the celebration photograph. On the Union Pacific, meanwhile, Irish immigrants made up a great share of the labour force. Many had lived through famine and war, only to meet new perils out on the plains. They beat back raids, laid track at astonishing speed, and drank themselves to sleep in flimsy tents. Their lives were hard, but their work was essential. Formerly enslaved African Americans also worked the rails, some taken on as freed men in search of a better life. Their contributions, like those of the Chinese and the Irish, went largely unacknowledged. Labourers of colour were exploited yet indispensable. This was a workforce drawn from many nations, building a country with bare hands and aching backs. And then came the cooks, the blacksmiths, the teamsters, and the supply haulers, each one keeping the great machine of progress turning. None of them held the title of executive, but without them there would have been no golden spike. In the grand American myth, we tend to shine the light on the visionaries and the tycoons. But railroads were never laid by dreams alone. They were laid by calloused hands, by underpaid men, by workers pushed to the margins, people who bent the course of history with no promise that anyone would remember them. They did not build the railroad for glory. They built it to stay alive. By the closing years of the 1860s, the two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were no longer simply laying track. They were caught up in a frantic rivalry, each charging toward an unseen meeting point somewhere in the Utah Territory. This was no gentleman's understanding. It was a struggle over land, money, and reputation. Why such haste? It came down to the way the government subsidies were structured. For every mile of finished track, each company collected federal land grants and sizable loans. The more track you put down, the more profit you took in. So, predictably, each side tried to outbuild the other, at times even laying parallel lines running in opposite directions, fully aware that only one set would ever be used. The whole thing grew absurd. Crews laboured at a breakneck pace. The Central Pacific, fresh from its conquest of the Sierra Nevada, now blasted across the deserts of Nevada and Utah, while the Union Pacific forded rivers and crossed high plains along the fringe of the Rocky Mountains. They even started laying track through stretches they knew the government would later call wasteful, simply to lock in the funding. The effort climbed to nearly frantic levels. The Central Pacific's Chinese crews set a world record in April of 1869, 10 miles of track laid in a single day, an achievement never since equalled. They managed it through coordinated teams, rotating shifts, and a rhythm sharpened over years of toil. The Union Pacific crews, unwilling to be outshone, drove hard from the east despite ongoing strikes, supply troubles, and the mismanagement of their financier, Thomas Durant, who cared more about manipulating stock than about the engineering of a railroad. At last, the two tracks drew near each other at Promontory Summit in present-day Utah. Surveyors marked out the spot and preparations were made for a formal ceremony. Locomotives from both companies, the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's number 11-9, were brought face to face, cowcatcher to cowcatcher. Executives readied their speeches. A special golden spike was commissioned. Telegraph wires were connected so that the final hammer blows could be carried across the country in real time. But beneath all the celebration lay an enduring truth. The race had been brutal, often reckless, and driven from start to finish by profit. The rails had finally met, yet the marks they pressed into the country, into its land, its workers, and the people who built it, would linger for generations. Progress had its finish line, and both companies proved willing to flatten whatever stood in the way of reaching it. On the 10th of May 1869, the wind-swept flats of Promontory Summit in Utah turned, for a moment, into the heart of the American world. Laborers, officials, reporters, and railroad executives assembled there to watch something extraordinary unfold. The meeting of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific lines, the finishing of the Transcontinental Railroad. Two polished locomotives faced one another, nose to nose, on the completed track, the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's number 11-9. A last rail rested between them, and at its middle sat a golden spike, its surface inscribed with the words, "May God continue the unity of our country, as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world." Telegraph wires had been fastened to the ceremonial hammer so that every strike would carry an electric pulse across the whole nation. When Leland Stanford, standing in for the Central Pacific, lifted the sledgehammer, people from one end of the country to the other paused to listen. With each downward swing, the telegraph clicked, and then came a single word: done. Church bells pealed, cannons thundered, and cities broke into celebration. From New York to San Francisco, it felt as though a great vein of the nation had been sewn together as it happened. East and West were no longer separated by months. They now stood 7 days apart by rail. The accomplishment in engineering was remarkable. The United States was bound from one coast to the other by steel and steam. The deeper meaning was hard to overstate. A young country, still healing after the Civil War, had shown it could knit its broken pieces back together and step into a modern industrial age. Yet not everyone shared in the festivities. None of the Chinese workers who had laid the bulk of the Central Pacific's track were asked to stand for the photograph. They had been left out of the ceremony altogether, even though their hands had made the impossible possible. The Irish labourers, the freedmen, the native guides, and other overlooked workers were missing from the picture as well. In their stead posed bearded men in frock coats, gripping hammers and cigars. So even as the country toasted its newfound unity, the truth ran deeper. The railroad did join east to west, but it also deepened the rifts between races, classes, and cultures. It tied markets together, yet the price was counted in human lives. The photograph taken that day preserved the official version of the railroad. The genuine story lay buried under the track itself. The finishing of the transcontinental line did far more than pull distances closer. It set the American economy alight. Nearly overnight, the United States stopped being two coasts clumsily linked across a stretch of wilderness. It became one economic body, alive with movement, trade, and possibility. Cargo that had once needed months to travel by wagon or by ship could now cross from one coast to the other in under a week. Harvests from the Midwest, the wheat, the corn, the cattle, could be carried west to thriving mining settlements, or east to the factory cities. Finished goods travelled the other way. Rail cars took the place of oxen, steam took the place of sail. What had been an uncertain frontier had turned into a profitable supply line. Towns sprang up like weeds beside the rails, railroad towns that appeared almost in a single night. Some swelled into cities, while others vanished as fast as they had arrived, especially when a line was rerouted. But each one served as a point in a widening web, joined by the steady cadence of pistons, whistles, and smoke. The railroad also gave industrial growth its fuel. Ironworks, coal mines, and timber mills all surged with demand. The hunger for rails, locomotives, and infrastructure produced work all across the country. Steel barons and railroad tycoons grew wealthy. And small operators caught the wave too, opening hotels, restaurants, and general stores along the line. Mail travelled quicker. News crossed time zones in days rather than weeks. For the first time, the government could make itself genuinely felt across the entire continent, sending troops, resources, and political weight wherever the rails ran. And the human side should not be forgotten. Millions of people moved westward. Immigrants from Europe who had once arrived in New York now saw a clear route toward land and work in California, Oregon, and the Western Territories. Homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws all traveled the same steel road toward whatever future awaited. This boom, of course, was not shared equally. Wealth gathered at the top, native lands were swallowed up, laborers stayed poor. But it cannot be denied. The railroad carried the United States from a regional republic toward a continental power. The engine was not only hauling people, it was hauling money, power, and the future itself. And once it had begun, nothing was going to halt it. Underneath the gleaming steel and the triumphant headlines of the Transcontinental Railroad rested a darker and more sorrowful legacy, the ruin of indigenous lands, lives, and cultures. The railroad did not merely link east and west. It cut straight through native homelands, carving paths across territories held by the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, the Ute, and many more. What had been open plains and sacred earth was now split apart by rails, telegraph poles, and fencing. With every spike that went down, native sovereignty was worn away. The consequences came swiftly and harshly. Buffalo herds, central to the economies, diets, and spiritual lives of the Plains tribes, were killed in enormous numbers to clear the path for trains and settlers. In certain cases, passengers were urged to shoot buffalo for sport from the moving cars. These herds, which had once counted in the tens of millions, fell to the edge of extinction within only a few decades. The railroad delivered more than track. It delivered settlers, soldiers, and surveyors. Towns rose where none had stood before. Homesteaders, backed by the federal government, laid claim to tribal lands. Whatever the treaties had not stripped away, the railroad now took in. And with the settlers came enforcement, military garrisons posted to guard the tracks and put down any resistance. Clashes broke out. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and other tribes resisted in what became a string of bitter wars. Some were called uprisings, others plainly massacres. From Red Cloud's War to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the railroads were at once the battleground and the prize. In the end, the resistance was broken. Indigenous nations were confined to reservations, frequently set hundreds of miles from the lands of their ancestors. The toll on the spirit was enormous. Sacred places were defiled, hunting patterns were severed, cultures shaped around seasonal travel, and vast open country were pressed into fixed places under constant watch, and every bit of it was excused in the name of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad was celebrated as a wonder of American ingenuity. But the cost was 1,000 nations' dreams. It was not only the iron that sliced through the land, it was the wiping away of a whole way of life, traded for timetables and timbers. History books often honor the railroad for binding a nation together, but for native peoples, it pulled their own apart. When the final spike went into the ground at Promontory Summit in 1869, it marked more than the end of a railroad. It marked the start of a new American identity, faster, hungrier, and more defined by steel and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad pulled the country inward. A journey that had once swallowed 6 months by wagon or ship now took 7 days by rail. It reshaped how people traveled, how goods changed hands, and how the very notion of distance was understood. All at once, the idea of a coast-to-coast nation stopped being a dream and became an everyday fact. The railroad gave rise to time zones, invented to coordinate travel and trade across the continent. It rearranged agriculture, letting farmers send their crops across state lines. It powered the Second Industrial Revolution, allowing raw materials to flow smoothly into the factories of the cities. The pulse of the country began to keep time with the clatter of trains. In cultural terms, the railroad strengthened the sense of manifest destiny, the conviction that America was meant to reach from Atlantic to Pacific. It made expansion feel not only possible, but unavoidable. With rails threading across deserts, mountains, and plains, the wild frontier seemed to disappear. Everything felt within reach. Everything felt there for the taking. But the railroad also laid down the pattern for corporate power in America. Vast fortunes piled up at the top. Men like Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and Collis Huntington did more than grow rich. They steered policy, purchased politicians, and assembled empires. Corruption scandals such as the Credit Mobilia affair revealed just how deeply railroad interests had wound themselves into the government. For labourers, the tracks stood for both opportunity and exploitation. For indigenous peoples, they stood for the end of a world. For the environment, they brought sweeping change. Forests cleared, rivers bridged, buffalo driven nearly to extinction. And yet, for all of its costs, the railroad unquestionably wove the fabric of a modern America. It linked immigrants to opportunity, businesses to markets, and governments to far-off territories. It turned an experimental republic into a fully unified nation. The iron rails did not just carry passengers. They carried ambition, destruction, hope, and hubris. The railroad was a triumph and a tragedy together. And from the moment those two locomotives met cowcatchers in the Utah desert, the country was never the same. The nation had been transformed, not by war or by election, but by iron and fire.